A poor single father was mocked when he inherited only $5 and an old key. But when he went to the abandoned ranch and unlocked the door it fit, he discovered something that would change everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun poured through the grimy blinds of the trailer, cutting thin stripes of light across the worn linoleum floor. Thomas Reed sat at the tiny kitchen table, elbows resting on the formica surface, staring at the final notice from the power company. The paper was creased, smudged with fingerprints, and heavy with the kind of words that had become all too familiar. Disconnection scheduled. He sighed, folding the paper neatly as if order might somehow erase the problem. From the back room came the sound of his 8-year-old son, Jake, humming off-key to a cartoon theme, the boy's small voice full of the kind of careless joy that no unpaid bill could touch. Thomas forced a smile, pushed himself to his feet, and poured the last of the milk into a chipped bowl of cereal. The carton gave a hollow glug, barely enough to dampen the flakes. Jake appeared barefoot, his hair a disheveled mess, his t-shirt inside out. "Morning, buddy," Thomas said. "Eat up before it turns into dust." The boy grinned, shoveling cereal with enthusiasm that made Thomas's chest ache with pride and guilt all at once. The pickup outside refused to start again, coughing twice before settling into silence. He hit the steering wheel, then leaned back and laughed softly, a dry laugh without humor. He used to fix engines for a living, and now he couldn't even keep his own truck running. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every day felt like a balancing act between exhaustion and necessity, between wanting to do better and simply surviving the week. The letter arrived that same afternoon, wedged under the trailer door when he came home from his second shift. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with the embossed seal of a law firm he didn't recognize. Inside, typed words informed him of the death of Raymond Reed, his grandfather, and a summons to the reading of the will. For a long moment, Thomas just stared at the letter, the name stirring an ache he thought he'd buried years ago. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather since he was 16. Their last conversation had ended with shouting and a slammed door. Raymond calling him reckless and ungrateful, Thomas calling him something worse, and now the old man was gone. That night, as he tucked Jake into bed, the boy asked about the letter. Was he nice? Jake wanted to know. Thomas hesitated. Memories of a tall, broad-shouldered man in a work shirt, smelling of oil and hay, flickered across his mind, then the memories of the arguments that followed. He was complicated, Thomas said finally, but he taught me how to work. That counts for something. The law office was in Mesa, nearly an hour's drive away. Thomas wore his cleanest shirt clean by the modest standards of a man who did laundry at the coin-op once a week and arrived 10 minutes early, clutching the invitation like a ticket to a place he didn't belong. The reception area smelled of lemon polish and professionalism. He saw them all there. His Uncle Nate in a tailored suit that cost more than Thomas's truck, Aunt Becky in pearls and a cloud of perfume, and two cousins who whispered to each other with smug confidence. They looked him up and down, taking in the scuffed boots, the patched jeans, the calloused hands. Nate greeted him with a grin too wide to be sincere. "Didn't think you'd make it, Tom. Gas prices being what they are." The cousins laughed. Thomas smiled tightly. The attorney, a gray-haired woman named Margaret Harlow, called everyone into the conference room. The long mahogany table gleamed under fluorescent lights, a quiet monument to wealth and permanence. She adjusted her glasses, shuffled her papers, and began to read. The voice she used was practiced, devoid of sentiment, a tone that could have announced the end of the world and made it sound like a routine filing. Raymond Reed had been a man of property and discipline. He had accumulated land, savings, and a small portfolio of investments during his long life. Each family member leaned forward as Margaret began listing the bequests. To Nate went the main house in Prescott and a collection of antique rifles. To Becky, a trust fund that would pay her an annual income for the rest of her life. To the cousins, shares in a storage business and bonds with tidy interest. Each announcement was met with nods and murmurs of satisfaction. Thomas sat quietly, hands folded, half listening, trying not to think about the overdue electric bill waiting back home. Then the lawyer paused. The rustle of papers stopped, and the room seemed to still. "To my grandson, Thomas Reed," she read slowly, I leave the contents of envelope number 6. She bent to retrieve a small manila envelope from her briefcase and placed it on the table in front of him. Her eyes flickered with something sympathy, amusement. He couldn't tell. He picked it up. It felt light. Too light. He slid a finger under the flap and pulled out its contents. A single crumpled $5 bill and an old brass key attached to a cracked leather tag. He turned them over in disbelief. The key was tarnished but solid, stamped with the letters R.C. Ranch. Aunt Becky snorted. Nate let out a low whistle. "Guess he really wanted to send you a message, huh?" one of the cousins said. "Maybe that's how much he figured you were worth." Laughter rolled around the table, brittle and cruel. Even the lawyer's lips twitched before she caught herself. Thomas felt his ears burn. He wanted to shout, to tell them that it didn't matter, that money didn't define him, but he knew that would sound hollow. They'd see through it. So he folded the bill carefully, slipped it and the key back into the envelope, and stood up. "Thanks for your time," he said, his voice steady though his hands trembled. The laughter followed him into the hallway like a swarm of bees. Outside, the sun was harsh and pitiless. His old truck sat where he'd left it, a dented relic among rows of glossy sedans. He got in, shut the door, and just sat there, breathing. His reflection stared back at him from the windshield-tired eyes, stubble, a man who'd been losing small battles for years. He opened the envelope again. The $5 bill was from an older series, the paper soft and worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. Nothing unusual, no markings or notes, just $5. But the key there was something about it. The way the letters RC were etched into the metal, the faint groove along the side like it had been turned in a lock hundreds of times. He rubbed his thumb over the surface, feeling the indentation of decades. RC Ranch. The words stirred something buried deep in memory. A red barn, the sound of wind turbines spinning in the distance, the scent of hay and motor oil. His grandfather's voice saying, "The wind's free, boy. You just have to be smart enough to catch it." He looked up at the fading afternoon sky, pale and cloudless. Maybe it was madness, but the thought took root all the same. There was only one place that key could fit, and it wasn't any door in this city. It belonged back there, in Red Creek. The ranch had been sold off years ago, maybe abandoned by now, but still something tugged at him. When he got home, Jake was on the floor building a tower from mismatched Lego pieces. "How'd it go?" the boy asked without looking up. Thomas hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We didn't get much, kiddo. Just a key." Jake glanced up, curious. "A key to what?" "That's what we're going to find out," Thomas said. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat at the small table long after Jake had drifted off, the envelope lying open beside a half-empty mug of coffee. The key glinted faintly under the light, a relic of something he didn't yet understand. He unfolded the $5 bill again, tracing the faded ink, thinking of the man who'd once taught him to change a spark plug, who'd yelled at him for wasting time, who'd slammed the door on him the day he left for good. Outside, the wind hissed through the trailer park, rattling the loose siding. Thomas leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was an insult, a final jab from a man who'd never forgiven him. But maybe, just maybe, it was something else. The next morning, while Jake got ready for school, Thomas found an old photograph in a box of keepsakes. Him as a boy, sitting on a fence post with a wide smile, his grandfather beside him, one massive hand resting on his shoulder. Behind them, a wooden sign read, "Red Creek Ranch," the same letters as on the key. He ran his thumb across the image, brushing away years of dust. The decision came as quietly as the morning light creeping through the blinds. After he dropped Jake off, he'd start driving north, just to see, to find out what was waiting on the other end of that key. He tucked the photo into his jacket pocket, along with the envelope. As he stepped outside, the wind lifted a swirl of dust across the parking lot, warm and restless. He squinted toward the horizon, where the desert highway stretched into shimmering distance. The key felt heavy in his hand now, like a question that had waited too long for an answer. He didn't know what he expected to find: an empty barn, maybe, or another locked door. But something deep inside told him this was more than a prank, more than a cruel joke. The old man had been many things, hard, stubborn, impossible, but never petty. If he'd left a key, it opened something worth seeing. Thomas climbed into the truck, turned the ignition, and after a long protest, the engine caught. He smiled, almost disbelieving. He looked at the key once more before setting it on the passenger seat beside him. "All right, Grandpa," he murmured. "Let's see what kind of game you're playing." As he pulled onto the road, the morning sun rose full and bright behind him, flooding the cracked windshield with gold. The trailer park receded in the mirror, replaced by open desert in the long ribbon of highway leading north, toward Red Creek, toward the ranch, toward whatever waited at the end of a rusted lock and a $5 inheritance. The highway stretched ahead of him like a faded ribbon through the desert, shimmering under the noon sun. Thomas drove with one hand resting on the steering wheel and the other loosely gripping the brass key, which he had looped onto a thin string hanging from the rearview mirror. It swung gently with every bump in the cracked asphalt, glinting when the light hit it just right. The hum of the old truck's tires was steady and hypnotic, giving him too much time to think. Red Creek Ranch. He hadn't said the name out loud in over 20 years. Jake sat beside him, earbuds dangling, drawing pictures in his notebook as the scenery slid by. Endless stretches of sand, sagebrush, and the occasional cluster of telephone poles marching into the distance. "How much longer?" the boy asked. "A couple of hours," Thomas said. "You said that an hour ago." "Then it's 1 hour closer," Thomas replied, and Jake rolled his eyes the way only children could when they were half annoyed, half amused. The road signs became fewer. The gas stations disappeared. They stopped once at a diner with peeling paint and a jukebox that hadn't worked since the 70s. The waitress, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, asked where they were headed. When Thomas mentioned Red Creek Ranch, she blinked in surprise. "That old place?" "Been closed up since before my daughter was born," she said. "I heard the county wanted to tear it down. Nobody's been out that way in years." Thomas thanked her, paid for 2 grilled cheeses, and went back to the truck with a strange feeling in his chest, a mixture of dread and curiosity that sat heavy just under his ribs. The wind outside had picked up, carrying sand that whispered against the windows like dry rain. When they finally reached the turnoff, the asphalt gave way to a dirt road flanked by brittle mesquite bushes. The land looked exactly as he remembered it, and yet different, emptier, smaller, as if time had stolen its confidence. The first thing he saw was the gate. It stood crooked, one hinge half broken, a faded wooden sign dangling by a single nail. The words Red Creek Ranch were barely visible beneath layers of dust and rust. A thick chain hung across the entrance, secured by a padlock that looked ancient. Thomas parked the truck, got out, and felt the dry heat press against his skin. The smell of sun-baked earth filled his lungs. Jake followed, squinting at the old sign. "This is it?" he asked. "Doesn't look like much." Thomas didn't answer. He reached for the chain, lifted the padlock, and examined it. The key slid into the slot with a reluctant scrape, catching halfway as if the lock itself were testing him. He turned it gently, felt resistance, then a sharp click. The chain fell away, and the gate creaked open. For a long moment he just stood there, staring into the overgrown path beyond. It felt like crossing a threshold, not just into a forgotten place, but into another life. They drove slowly up the dirt track, tires crunching over gravel. The main house emerged first, a squat, 2-story structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. The porch sagged, the front door hung ajar. Beyond it stretched the land he remembered as boundless fields of alfalfa and corn, now consumed by weeds. To the left stood the old barn, its roof bowed inward. One side collapsed under years of neglect. The wind moaned through the gaps, carrying the scent of dust and dry wood. Thomas stepped out and walked toward the barn. Every footstep stirred memories, the smell of oil and hay, the echo of his grandfather's boots on wooden floors, the feel of the man's calloused hand on his shoulder as he taught him how to check a tractor engine. He remembered sitting on a hay bale as a child, watching the blades of the early wind turbines spin lazily against the sunset. Back then he hadn't understood what Raymond was building or why. To him, the turbines were just giant toys for catching the wind. Inside, the air was thick with dust, Shafts of sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating floating specks that drifted like tiny spirits. Rusted tools hung from nails on the walls, and an overturned wheelbarrow lay in one corner, half buried under straw. Thomas ran his fingers over the worn handles of a workbench, tracing grooves left by decades of use. Something inside him stirred, a quiet respect for the stubbornness that had built this place, and a pang of shame that he'd abandoned it without ever looking back. Jake followed cautiously, holding a flashlight from his backpack. "It's like a haunted house," he whispered. "Not haunted," Thomas said softly, "just forgotten." They explored the lower level, moving between piles of scrap metal and crates filled with old parts, bolts, gears, and pieces of machinery Thomas couldn't immediately identify. A faded blueprint hung on the wall near the far end of the barn, the edges curling inward. It showed the outline of what looked like a wind turbine, hand-drawn and annotated with numbers. Beside it, carved into the wooden beam, was something that stopped him cold. A small inscription, rough and uneven, just 3 letters, J. He remembered carving that with his cousin Jack one summer when they were kids. They'd spent the whole afternoon hiding from Raymond's chores, promising to come back and add their initials every year. But Jack had left for the city, and Thomas had followed soon after. The sight of it now, faded and splintered, hit him like a blow. So much time lost, so many chances missed. Outside, the sun was beginning to sink, staining the horizon with amber light. Thomas was about to call it a day when Jake pointed to something near the back corner of the barn. "Dad, what's that?" he said. Half hidden beneath a tangle of boards and an old tarp was a square section of flooring that looked different from the rest, newer, smoother. Thomas knelt, brushed away the dust, and found a faint outline of a trapdoor. He pried at the edge with a crowbar until it creaked open, revealing a narrow set of steps descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of metal and earth. Jake shone his flashlight into the opening. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing concrete walls and something large and rectangular at the far end. Thomas's pulse quickened. "Stay here, Misharimer," he said, though Jake was already shaking his head. "No way, I'm coming." Together they descended the narrow steps. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the confined space. When they reached the bottom, Thomas realized the room was small, no more than 10 feet across. Dust blanketed everything. In the center stood a heavy metal safe, waist-high, its door stamped with the same initials as the key or C. He approached it slowly, heart pounding. There was a moment of hesitation, a thought that maybe he shouldn't, that whatever was locked inside might change everything in ways he couldn't predict. But the curiosity was stronger. He reached into his pocket, took out the key, and slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly, turning with a reluctant groan. A deep click echoed through the room. The door swung open with surprising ease. Inside lay a stack of folders bound with brittle string, several notebooks, and a sealed envelope with his name written across it in neat, careful handwriting. The sight of that handwriting made his throat tighten. It was unmistakably Raymond Strong, but slightly slanted, the handwriting of a man who valued precision. Thomas picked up the envelope, brushed off the dust, and felt the weight of years pressing on his chest. He didn't open it yet. Instead, he lifted one of the notebooks. The cover was leather, cracked and faded, embossed with the year 1974. He flipped it open and found pages filled with diagrams and notes formulas, sketches of turbine blades, lists of test results. The language was technical but methodical. Raymond had been working on something improving the design, refining the mechanism that captured wind energy. The entries stretched across decades, chronicling experiments, failures, and breakthroughs. A realization settled over Thomas like a slow dawn. His grandfather hadn't been just a stubborn old rancher. He'd been an inventor, an engineer of sorts, a man ahead of his time. The letters RC weren't just the name of the ranch. They were the initials of the company he'd tried to build. Red Creek Energy. Jake peered over his shoulder. Is that what he did? Built machines? Looks like it, Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. He was trying to make the wind work for him. He placed the notebook back carefully and looked again at the sealed envelope. It was yellowed at the edges, the glue brittle. His name, Thomas, was written in a steady hand, that somehow made him feel 12 years old again, standing in front of the old man after doing something wrong. He hesitated, unsure whether to open it now or wait until morning. The air in the small room felt heavy, charged with memory. He slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket. "Come on," he said quietly. "We'll look at this later." They climbed back up into the fading light. The sun had almost vanished, leaving behind streaks of rose and gold that painted the fields in soft fire. Thomas stood for a long while outside the barn, looking toward the horizon, where the skeletal remains of one of Raymond's old turbines still stood against the sky, its blades rusted but intact. The wind picked up again, moving through the weeds with a whisper that sounded almost like words. Jake tugged at his sleeve. "Can we stay here tonight?" he asked. Thomas looked down at him and nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I think we should." They brought sleeping bags into the house, cleared a space near the old fireplace, and built a small fire from fallen branches. The walls groaned as if remembering their former life. Jake fell asleep quickly, the glow of the flames flickering across his face. Thomas sat awake long after, the unopened envelope on his knees. He stared into the fire, listening to the wind howl softly outside. The same wind that had turned his grandfather's turbines once upon a time. The same wind that had carried a dying man's final secret into the hands of the grandson who'd run away from everything he stood for. When he finally tore the envelope open, the first thing he saw was his own name written again inside, followed by words that made his breath catch. "If you are reading this, it means you have come back. Good. You were always meant to." Thomas let the paper rest on his lap, eyes unfocused, heart pounding with questions. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the turbines creaked in the night wind, like giants stirring in their sleep, waiting for the dawn. The morning came pale and cold, the kind of desert dawn that tricked the senses, soft light that promised warmth, but carried a lingering chill. Thomas woke to the crackling sound of the fire's last embers and the faint rustle of wind against the boarded windows. For a moment, he wasn't sure where he was. Then the smell of dust, ash, and aged wood brought it back. The ranch, the barn, the safe, and the letter waiting to be read in the gray light of day. Jake was still asleep, wrapped in his blanket like a small cocoon, one arm flung across his stuffed bear. The sight steadied Thomas's heart. He remembered being that age, sleeping under the same roof when the ranch had been alive, when laughter and work had filled every hour of the day. Back then, his grandfather's voice had been constant, a sound that commanded respect and left no room for argument. It was strange how easily those sounds returned after so many years of silence. He rose quietly, fed a few dry branches to the fire until it flared back to life, and stepped outside. The air smelled of sage and old rain. The sky stretched wide and endless above him, streaked with lavender clouds that caught the first blush of sunlight. The barn loomed across the field, its walls dark with shadow, the door hanging slightly open from last night. The memory of the safe called to him, and he felt the weight of the unopened letter still in his jacket pocket. He had read only the first few words before sleep overtook him, but those words, "You were always meant to," had lodged deep in his chest. When he went back inside the barn, the light fell in slanted beams through the holes in the roof, stirring dust motes that floated like tiny ghosts. He descended into the small underground room once more, the air damp and cold, his footsteps echoing softly. The safe stood open, its contents just as he had left them. He pulled the envelope from his pocket, smoothed it flat, and began to read. The handwriting was steady but older now, the ink uneven in places where the pen must have trembled. "Thomas," it began, "if you are reading this, it means you have found what I left behind, and that alone tells me you are not the man your family thinks you are. I did not leave you $5 to insult you. I left you the same amount I had in my pocket the day I decided to begin again. I wanted you to remember what it feels like to start from nothing." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice, firm but not unkind. The letter continued. Red Creek Ranch was never just a farm. It was an idea, a seed planted in stubborn soil. When the banks turned me away, when everyone told me it couldn't be done, I took the last of my money and built my first turbine by hand. I believed the wind could work for us instead of against us. For a while I was right. We formed a small company, Red Creek Energy, and we made progress. But then came the partners who wanted quick profit and the investors who couldn't wait. When it failed, I kept what I could: the patents, the land, and the dream. Thomas lowered the letter for a moment, running his fingers over the stacks of notebooks in the safe. Red Creek Energy. The words carried both pride and tragedy. He could imagine his grandfather, sleeves rolled up, blueprints spread across the workbench, trying to solve the riddle of the wind. A man chasing possibility long before such dreams had names like sustainability or renewable energy. He read on. I don't know how much of this will make sense to you. Maybe you found your own path by now, or maybe life has taken more from you than it has given. But I know you, boy. You've got the same fire that burned in me, too proud to beg, too stubborn to quit. I made mistakes with your father, and with you. I thought discipline was love, and silence was strength. I see now that I was wrong. I can't fix that now, but I can give you the means to fix something else. These patents, this land, they're not relics. They're keys, just like the one you used to get here. It's up to you what door you open with them. The words blurred as Thomas's vision misted. He blinked, swallowing hard. For years he had told himself he didn't care what his grandfather thought, that the old man's approval meant nothing. But here, in the hollow quiet of the earth, he realized how deep the wound had gone, how much of his anger had been built on grief. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket. Back in the daylight, Jake was sitting on the porch step, munching an apple he'd found in their cooler. What was in the letter? He asked between bites. Thomas sat beside him, staring across the field where the tall grass bent and swayed in the wind. Your great-grandpa left us more than I thought, he said. Papers, designs, maybe something valuable. Like money? Jake asked hopefully. Maybe. Or maybe something better than money. They spent the next few hours exploring the house, searching for any additional clues. Most of the rooms were empty except for furniture covered in sheets and the lingering smell of old smoke. In the upstairs study, Thomas found an old typewriter, its keys stiff with rust, and a faded calendar from 1982 still pinned to the wall. The date circled in red read, contract meeting. Beneath it, in his grandfather's handwriting, the words, hold your ground. He couldn't help but smile. Even in failure, the old man had been defiant. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Thomas spread the documents from the safe across the dining table. The patents were real, stamped with government seals and serial numbers. There were correspondence letters, 2 names of partners he'd never heard of. Corporations that probably no longer existed. He recognized just enough of the terminology to know these weren't toys or prototypes. They were real engineering work, decades ahead of their time. The temptation to sell them, to turn this find into quick money, surfaced immediately. He thought of overdue bills, of Jake's worn sneakers, of the never-ending stretch of paychecks that vanished before the month's end. He could call a lawyer, or one of the companies listed on the letters. He could walk away from the ranch, from the uncertainty, from the ache of family ghosts. It would be so easy. But then he remembered the line from the letter. I left you the same amount I had when I decided to begin again. The $5 was not a mockery. It was a mirror. His grandfather had started from nothing and built something that lasted long enough for him to find it decades later. Thomas realized he was standing at the same crossroads the old man had faced. Surrender or creation. The key, the safe, the letter, they were all pointing him toward a choice. That night, after Jake had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone by the fire again, the ranch silent except for the steady breath of wind through the rafters. He took one of the notebooks from the safe and opened it at random. The pages were filled with calculations, sketches, and short notes written in the same sharp hand. Efficiency improved 8% with curvature adjustment. Test model failed in gust rethink foundation bolts. One day, this will matter. He traced the words with his finger and whispered, one day. He closed his eyes and saw the turbines that used to stand on this land, tall and gleaming, turning sunlight and wind into motion. For the first time in years, he felt something ignite inside him that wasn't anger or weariness. It was purpose. The next morning, he packed the papers carefully into a metal box and locked it in the truck. He drove into the nearest town to find the library, where an old computer with slow internet hummed in a corner. He spent hours researching the patents, cross-referencing company names, and learning about renewable energy advancements. What he discovered stunned him. The fundamental design of his grandfather's turbine, the variable angle blades and internal gearing system, had become the standard in modern wind energy technology. Every company in the industry owed part of its success to ideas that began here, on Red Creek Ranch. By the time he returned, the light was fading again. The air smelled like rain, though the sky remained cloudless. He stood outside the barn, watching the fields shift in the wind. Somewhere in that endless motion, he felt a presence, not a ghost, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as though the old man were standing beside him. "Grandpa," he said aloud, "I don't know if I can do what you did, but I'll try." He turned toward the house where Jake's laughter echoed faintly through the open window. The sound filled the empty spaces of the ranch like a blessing. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That night he took out the $5 bill, still wrinkled and soft from years of handling, and placed it in a cheap wooden frame he found in one of the drawers. He hung it above the workbench in the barn, right where the morning light would touch it first. Beneath it, he laid out the notebooks, the patents, and a set of tools he'd brought from the truck. Tomorrow he would start small cleaning the barn, restoring one of the smaller turbines that still stood at the edge of the property. It wouldn't produce much, but it would be a beginning. He looked at the frame bill, the tarnished key resting beside it, and felt a quiet certainty take root. His grandfather's test was never about inheritance or money. It was about courage, the willingness to build something meaningful from nothing. Outside, the wind rose again, stronger this time, rushing through the broken slats of the barn until they hummed softly, like the first low note of a song not yet finished. Thomas smiled and whispered to the darkness, "Let's see if I can catch it." The days that followed began quietly, almost cautiously, as though the ranch itself were waking from a long sleep. Each morning, Thomas stepped out into the crisp desert air, feeling the wind that swept across the fields and whispered through the dry grass. It no longer sounded hollow to him. It felt alive, insistent, a reminder that there was work to be done. The decision he had made after reading his grandfather's letter had set something in motion. There was no turning back now. He started by reclaiming the house from years of abandonment. Dust and cobwebs surrendered slowly to his determination. The kitchen came first. He scrubbed the counters, patched the cracked window, and coaxed life back into the old stove with a few spare parts scavenged from a junkyard in town. Every repair was a small act of defiance against time. Jake helped as best he could, running around with a broom that was nearly his height, pretending to chase the dust away like a dragon slayer. His laughter filled the empty rooms, and soon the ranch no longer felt haunted. It felt like home. They set up camp in the barn while the house's plumbing and wiring remained unreliable. At night, under the creak of the rafters and the soft sigh of the wind, Thomas studied his grandfather's notebooks by lantern light. The diagrams fascinated him, the elegant simplicity of each drawing, the annotations in firm, confident handwriting. There was genius in those lines. Some of the designs were decades old, yet they contained principles still in use today. He began sketching variations in the margins, adjusting measurements, adding notes in his own hand. Somewhere in the middle of those late hours, the boundary between past and present blurred. He felt as though Raymond Reed were still there, leaning over his shoulder, challenging him to keep going. When he went into town to buy lumber and basic supplies, the locals were curious. A few recognized his last name and asked if he was related to Old Man Reed. Their voices carried a mix of nostalgia and pity. "That ranch used to be something," one man told him, shaking his head. "Tried to make windmills work back before anyone believed in that sort of thing. Shame it all went under." Thomas only smiled and said he was trying to bring a little of it back. Most of them wished him luck with the kind of politeness reserved for lost causes. He worked alone at first, repairing the roof of the barn, replacing boards, rewiring the old fuse box. But the ranch seemed to draw people and curious neighbors who stopped by, old-timers who remembered Raymond's stubborn determination. One of them was a wiry man in his 70s named Bill Clark, who introduced himself as having once been the brains behind the old man's nuts and bolts. When Thomas mentioned the turbines, Clark's eyes lit up. "You found the plans?" he asked, as though hearing of a treasure recovered from the sea. When Thomas showed him the notebooks, the old man handled them with reverence. "He was close," Clark murmured. "Closer than anyone knew. If we'd had better bearings and stronger mounts back then, this place could have powered half the county." That night they pored over the designs together. Clark's memory was sharp, his hands steady despite age. He pointed out adjustments, small improvements that could make the old system viable again with modern materials. It felt almost like a reunion between two generations of the same dream. Over the following weeks, other hands joined them. A few local teenagers started showing up after school, curious about the wind farm project. Thomas taught them to sand, weld, and measure, treating every mistake as part of the process. They laughed, argued, learned. Slowly, the barn filled not just with tools and blueprints, but with energy, human and otherwise. Progress came in fits and starts. The first attempt to erect a small turbine ended in failure when a support bolt snapped during testing. The structure shuddered and collapsed in a heap of twisted metal. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder. For a moment, silence reigned. Then Jake, wide-eyed but brave, said, "We can fix it, right?" Thomas forced a smile. "That's exactly what we're going to do." That night, sitting in the dim light of the workshop, he reread one of his grandfather's notes. "Failure is the wind's way of asking you to listen better." He understood it now. They rebuilt, this time with stronger parts. When the second turbine finally spun without shaking itself apart, the entire group stood in awe. The blades turned slowly at first, then faster, humming a low, steady note. The bulb connected to its small generator flickered, and then glowed bright. Jake whooped, jumping up and down. Thomas felt something inside him break open, an overwhelming mixture of relief and gratitude. He hadn't just fixed an old machine. He'd revived a vision that had been waiting decades to breathe again. The local paper sent a young journalist to interview him after hearing rumors of the mechanic who rebuilt a windmill from the past. Thomas tried to downplay it, saying it was just a small experiment. But when the article came out with the headline, "Single Father Revives Forgotten Dream at Red Creek Ranch," people began stopping by the property. Some offered donations, others simply wanted to see the turbine spin. The attention made him uneasy at first, but he couldn't deny the quiet pride that stirred within him. Challenges kept coming. The county inspector arrived one afternoon, clipboard in hand, demanding paperwork and compliance with building codes that hadn't even existed in his grandfather's time. For a week, Thomas wrestled with bureaucracy, poring over legal documents late into the night. He learned, adapted, argued when necessary, and refused to let red tape smother progress. Clark stood by him, providing technical jargon the officials barely understood. Eventually, the permits were approved, if only because no one could find a regulation that said a man couldn't harness the wind on his own land. But not everyone was happy about it. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, a sleek black car rolled up the dusty road. Thomas recognized the driver even before the door opened, his uncle Nate, stepping out in a tailored suit that didn't belong in the desert. The older man smiled like a man greeting a stray dog. "I saw the article," he said smoothly. "Quite the little project you've got here. Thought maybe we should talk about ownership." The conversation that followed was sharp-edged. Nate hinted that the patents and land might legally still be part of the broader estate, implying lawsuits, leverage, complications. But Thomas had done his homework. Every document, every deed, every signature was clean. His grandfather had transferred ownership of the ranch years before his death. "This isn't about family property anymore," Thomas told him evenly. "It's about legacy, and that stays here." Nate left with a cold smile and a promise to see him in court, but no papers ever came. The silence that followed spoke louder than any threat. By summer, the ranch had changed beyond recognition. The weeds had been cleared, new panels and wiring snaked across the property, and two turbines now stood side by side, their white blades gleaming under the sun. Thomas had partnered with the local school to bring students for weekend workshops. They learned not just about engineering, but about patience, persistence, and the value of failure. Jake took charge of guiding younger kids, showing them how to assemble small wind models. Watching his son's confidence grow was a reward greater than any inheritance. Still, there were nights when exhaustion crept in, when Thomas sat alone on the porch staring at the turbines and wondering if he was chasing ghosts. The wind was constant, its voice both comforting and relentless. Sometimes it felt like his grandfather was still testing him, asking whether he would falter when things got hard. But then he would look toward the house, where Jake's laughter still echoed, and he knew the answer. The first time the turbines powered something beyond the ranch was a milestone he would never forget. The small system they built generated enough electricity to light the community library in town. When the lights flickered on that evening, people gathered outside in astonishment. Someone clapped, someone else shouted his name. But Thomas stayed silent, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the warm glow spill from the windows. For the first time in years, he felt like he was giving something back. When he returned home that night, he went to the barn and looked at the framed $5 bill on the wall. The paper had faded, but the meaning had not. It reminded him of the man who had started this journey with nothing but stubbornness and a dream. He placed a hand on the frame, whispering, "I think we're finally catching up to you, Grandpa." The wind outside rose again, sweeping across the land, bending the grass, turning the blades of the turbines in slow, graceful arcs. The hum filled the air like a heartbeat. The ranch was no longer silent, no longer forgotten. It had a voice again, a voice of labor, memory, and renewal. And in that sound, Thomas heard the echo of every lesson his grandfather had ever tried to teach him. That the past isn't a weight meant to hold you down, but a foundation meant to lift you higher. He stood there for a long time, watching the turbines spin against the starlit sky, until the hum of their motion blended with the soft rhythm of his own breathing. The Red Creek Ranch, once abandoned to dust and regret, was alive again. And for the first time since his wife's death, Thomas Reed truly believed that he and his son had a future worth building. The wind had become a familiar voice by then, a steady companion that moved through the valleys of Red Creek Ranch like an invisible river. Thomas had learned to listen to it, the way it shifted tone before a storm, the way it hummed softly when the turbines turned at perfect balance. The land was alive again, and with each passing month it seemed to draw more people, more stories, more life. What had once been a broken inheritance had become a living legacy. It had been 3 years since the first turbine came to life. The ranch now stretched wide and purposeful, its old bones restored with new energy. 3 full-sized turbines rose against the horizon, their white blades gleaming in the sunlight, and a 4th was under construction. The barn had been rebuilt into a hybrid workshop and classroom where visitors came to learn about renewable energy, rural restoration, and the power of persistence. On weekends, families from nearby towns visited, their children laughing as they watched small wind models spin in the yard while Jake, now 12, explained how they worked with the confidence of someone twice his age. The transformation had gone beyond machinery and buildings. The community that once pitied the Reed name now saw it as a symbol of endurance. Local papers called Thomas the man who rebuilt Red Creek, though he never took much pleasure in the attention. For him, the real victory was quieter, the steady hum of turbines powering homes, the letters from small towns asking for advice on how to restore their own forgotten properties, the sight of his son running through fields that had once been dry and dead. But with growth came new choices, and choices always carried weight. One late afternoon, as golden light washed across the ranch, Thomas sat at the porch table with a stack of mail. Among the bills and thank you notes was an envelope with the logo of a major energy company printed on it. Inside was a formal letter offering a partnership, or perhaps more accurately, a buyout. They wanted to expand operations, build dozens of turbines across the valley, promising millions in investment and guaranteed profits. It was the kind of offer that could change everything again. Money enough to secure Jake's education, to rebuild the town's infrastructure, to erase every debt he'd ever known. He read the letter twice, then set it aside and stared out at the horizon. The turbines turned steadily in the distance, their blades flashing silver against the lowering sun. He could hear his grandfather's voice again, calm and patient, telling him that real wealth wasn't measured in numbers, but in what those numbers could make possible. And yet, he also heard another voice, his own, weary and cautious, whispering of all the times life had punished him for choosing the harder path. That evening, he took a long walk across the property, The moon was rising, silvering the dry grass in the shadows of the turbines. He passed the barn where light still spilled from the windows inside. A group of local students were working on a small wind generator prototype, guided by Clark, who had refused to retire despite his years. They waved as he passed. He nodded back, a quiet pride settling over him. They were learning, building, believing. Maybe that was the true inheritance, not just from Raymond, but from him as well. When he reached the edge of the property, he sat on a weathered fence post and pulled the folded $5 bill from his pocket. The edges were soft and frayed now, the ink faded almost to gray. He had started carrying it everywhere, a talisman and a reminder. In that moment, he thought about the first time he saw it in the lawyer's office, when his cousins laughed and called it an insult. He thought about the humiliation he had swallowed that day, the weight of being seen as the man who'd inherited nothing. And he thought of how that single scrap of paper had turned out to be worth more than their entire fortunes combined, because it had led him back here, to this place, to purpose. He stayed there until the wind grew cold. The turbines groaned softly above him, each rotation like the beating of a slow, powerful heart. By the time he returned to the house, he knew his answer. The next morning, he called the energy company and politely declined. "Red Creek stays independent," he said simply. "We're not for sale." The executive on the other end tried to argue, to appeal to logic and profit, but Thomas had already hung up. In the following months, his decision drew both admiration and criticism. Some called him foolish for refusing a fortune, but most understood, especially those who had seen what the ranch had become. He applied for grants instead, partnering with environmental organizations and universities that valued education over ownership. Soon, Red Creek Ranch became not just a local project, but a model across the state. Schools sent students to learn about renewable energy. Engineers volunteered their time to refine the old patents, developing new prototypes inspired by Raymond's original designs. One of those engineers, a young woman named Melissa, helped Thomas expand the small power grid that now supplied electricity to nearly a dozen nearby homes and public buildings. Together, they worked side by side, translating his grandfather's ideas into modern technology. It was through that collaboration that Thomas realized how far he'd come, not just in skill, but in faith. He had stopped waiting for permission to build. He simply built. Meanwhile, Jake had grown into a teenager with the same stubborn glint that had once defined Raymond. He spoke often about studying engineering, about creating machines that could bring light to remote villages and isolated farms. One evening, as they stood watching the turbines turn against a crimson sunset, Jake said, "Do you think Great-Grandpa knew it would end up like this?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe not exactly like this, but I think he hoped for something like it." "What about you?" Jake asked. "Did you?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't, not at first. But sometimes life hands you something small, a key, a piece of metal, a few dollars, and if you follow it, it leads you somewhere bigger than you could ever plan." Years later, that conversation would return to him in flashes, like the echo of wind through the rafters. Because soon, Red Creek Ranch would change again. The nonprofit foundation he'd helped establish, Reed Renewable, began receiving national attention. Documentaries were made about the project, featuring footage of the turbines and the local workers whose lives had been changed. Donations poured in from people inspired by the story. A single father, a forgotten farm, a second chance born out of $5 and a key. When the foundation finally built its first satellite facility in another county, Thomas and Jake attended the ribbon cutting together. As the crowd applauded and the new turbine began its slow rotation, Thomas felt the same familiar pull in his chest, the blend of awe and gratitude that had carried him through every failure and triumph. He looked down at Jake, taller now, confident and certain, and realized that the boy standing beside him was no longer just his son. He was the next keeper of the wind. Back at the ranch that evening, after the crowd had gone and the lights were dim, Thomas walked into the barn one last time. The framed $5 bill still hung above the workbench, and beside it, the tarnished brass key gleamed faintly in the low light. He ran his hand over both, feeling their rough textures, and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa. We made it mean something." Outside, the turbines turned steadily, their rhythm merging with the heartbeat of the land. The sound filled the night soft, endless, full of promise. In it, Thomas heard the story of his family, not just of loss and redemption, but of persistence, love, and belief in small beginnings. The same wind that had once destroyed his grandfather's dream now carried it across generations, shaping futures far beyond this valley. When he stepped back out into the cool night, he saw Jake standing by the fence staring up at the sky. "It's windy tonight," Jake said. "Yeah," Thomas replied, smiling. "It always will be." He looked toward the horizon where the blades spun against the stars, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely at peace. The legacy of the wind was not just about machines or energy or wealth. It was about resilience, the courage to build when others stopped believing, the strength to start again with nothing, and the wisdom to pass it forward. Raymond Reed had left his grandson $5 and a key, but what he had truly given him was a lesson that outlived them both, that every gust of wind carried a chance for rebirth, if only you had the faith to catch it. If you enjoyed this story, don't just scroll. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got more unbelievable true life stories waiting for you, the kind that make you question everything. Share this video with someone who loves a good mystery and stay tuned. The next one will blow your mind.